evening and welcome to Hackney Council's Planning Subcommittee meeting. My name is Councillor Steve Race. I'll be chairing this evening's meeting. The meeting will be recorded and is being live streamed on YouTube. Councillors taking part and voting this evening are present here in the council chamber. If any committee members are accessing this meeting remotely, I believe there is at least one. They're reminded that they're not counted as being present for the purposes of the Local Government Act 1972, and they will not be able to vote on any items under consideration. At the discretion of the chair, they may, however, be able to contribute to the discussion and participate in a non-decision making capacity. Welcome to members of the public and press who are joining us this evening to participate in or to observe this meeting. For anyone joining the meeting remotely, be it via Google Meet, there's a chat function. However, please only use this to raise IT-related issues. I won't be monitoring it as chair of the committee. In the event of an internet outage, which fingers crossed will not happen again this evening, we'll adjourn the meeting and then come back and continue once it's resolved. Firstly, I'll turn to my fellow planning subcommittee members and ask them to please introduce themselves from the front row.
Sarah Young.
Jess Webb, Vice Chair.
Ali Sadek.
Claire Potter.
Claire Joseph.
Great, thanks very much. There are various council officers present at this meeting this evening, both in the room and joining us remotely, including the following. We have the Growth Team Manager, Graham Callan. We have DM and Enforcement Manager, John Sang. And then other council officers in attendance. We've got Gareth Sykes to my right, who's the Governance Services Officer. We have Legal Officer, Sam Woodhead. And we've got ICT Officer online, Mario Karaman. The following planning case officers will be presenting the following planning applications this evening. So on agenda 9 will be led by Alex Hauser, and on agenda item 10 will be led by Jared Livett. Some of you joining us this meeting would have contacted the governance officer in advance of this meeting to register to speak. Objectors to the applications and representatives of the applicant are also in attendance. Before we continue, I'll briefly outline how this meeting will proceed. We'll hear each planning application in turn, summarised by the planning officer. We'll then hear a 5-minute statement from the objectors, followed by a 5-minute statement from any applicant. If there's more than one speaker from an applicant or an objector, they will have to agree amongst themselves beforehand how they want to split the 5-minute speaking time. Members of the planning subcommittee will then be free to ask questions of the planning officer, objectors, or any applicants. And in my role as chair of the planning subcommittee, I'll ensure that members have everything they need to make a decision. The objectors and applicants have the opportunity to set out their case and that the meeting runs properly. I'll not be taking any contributions from the floor. You must have given notice to the governance officer before the meeting to register to speak. The deadline for the registering to speak was 4 PM yesterday, and the speakers list is now closed. Subcommittee members are not representing either their wards or their political parties. Members will make decisions on the basis of site visits they've made, what we've read in the published application report, and of course what we hear this evening. We must make any decision on application in accordance with the Council's development plan, including the Council's local plan LP 33 and the London Plan 2021, unless relevant material planning considerations indicate otherwise. Subcommittee members are reminded not to take into account or discuss non-material planning matters, and when taking a decision, members should not have allowed themselves to prejudge any application prior to this meeting. Similarly, if a member has any interest relating to an application on the meeting agenda, they must consider whether that interest ought to be disclosed, and where appropriate, they must withdraw from the meeting while that application is discussed and voted upon. When we've finished our deliberations on a planning application, I'll read out the recommendation as set out in the published application report, and then members will vote on the recommendation by raising their hand. When the decision is at the end of the matter for this subcommittee, the applicant may appeal our decision and objectors may seek legal redress. I advise you to seek legal advice in either case if that is the case for you. Finally, depending on how the meeting this evening progresses, we'll take a short break at 8 o'clock, and we'll now continue with the published meeting's order of business, which for this meeting is item 2, the terms of reference of the planning subcommittee meeting. So I'm just going to invite members of the planning.
Chair, just you slightly raced ahead. It was actually because I thought you were going to do your opening statement after item 1. So
right,
just to go backwards slightly, sorry about this, everybody. Item 1, which is introduced by the governance officer, it's just to note the appointment of Councillor Race as chair and Councillor Webb as vice chair of the planning subcommittee meeting for the municipal year 2023 to 2024. So if the committee could note those appointments, please.
Noted ourselves.
Noted.
Thank you very much.
Great.
So now we're
now I
item
can
2.
do the terms of reference for the committee. Thank you. Can members note the terms of reference for the committee as per the pack?
Noted.
Noted, thank you very much. And then I have two apologies for absence so far. Councillor Desmond, Councillor Narcross.
That is correct, Chair. I understand Councillor Samatar is joining us virtually, but I do not see her on my screen.
But she may join us at
Okay,
some point. Fine. Agenda item number 4, are there any declarations of interest? No, thank you. And then Governance Officer, were there any proposals or questions referred to us by the Monitoring Officer?
None, Chair.
Thank you very much. Now, we've got item 6, which is minutes of the previous meeting. Can members agree minutes of the previous meeting held on the 3rd of May as a true and accurate record of proceedings? Agreed. Thank you. You'll note that we have had application, agenda item number 7, the Telephone House application has been withdrawn, as has item number 8, the Morning Lane Arches application. So we go straight on in that case to item number 9, which is 107 to 117 and 133 to 141 Morning Lane. And we are being led off in this case by Alex.
Thank you, Councillor Race. So item 9 relates to application 2023/0356, which is for 107 to 117 and 133. The application seeks approval for a change of use from restricted retail, so use class A1, to commercial business and service use class, which is use class E. Following the publication of the committee papers, minor changes were made to the published report as outlined within the addendum, including updating 2 conditions relating to cycle parking and the maximum size of retail units. So the application site comprises 2 parcels of land located at 107 to 117 Morning Lane on the corner of Churchwell Path and Morning Lane, and 113 to 141 on the corner with Ling Street and Morning Lane. The site is located within a priority industrial area, central major town centre. Each site contains a 3-storey building plus basement that runs parallel to the London Overground Railway line and were completed in 2016 as part of redevelopment of the area known as Hackney Walk. Both buildings are currently vacant. The western building has a gross internal area of 1,464 square metres and was historically occupied by Nike. The eastern unit has a GIA of 1,003 square metres and has never been occupied. So for background to this, planning permission was granted at the site in 2014 for the erection of these 2 buildings to provide space. The scheme resulted in a loss of approximately 700 square metres of land previously used for employment floor space, but was granted due to a specific set of circumstances that were unique to the site and which presented an opportunity that was considered would provide jobs and boost the economy as part of the wider Hackney Fashion Hub regeneration scheme. A condition included on the original permission restricted the A1 use to clothing and clothing accessories only in order to safeguard the vitality and viability of the nearby Hackney major town centre and to ensure that the units were used specifically for fashion retail, which was one of the specific contributing factors that was considered on balance to result in an acceptable scheme. Changing market demands and the COVID-19 pandemic have resulted in limited occupier demand for such restricted use within the 2 buildings, and the buildings are both vacant, the eastern one having been so since its construction in 2016. As such, the current application seeks to revitalise the underutilised site and allow for a more flexible use in the form of the E-use class. It is important to note that the A1 use class has been revoked and the former fashion use of the site now falls within use class E. So the loss of the restricted retail use will not result in a departure from policies and is considered a positive response at the site. The proposed commercial use is broadly supported in policy terms. However, the location of the site within a priority industrial area requires proposals to maximise the delivery of industrial floor space and include the maximum viable amount of employment floor space as outlined within policy LP 28. Given the location of the site and its surroundings and the floor plates of the two buildings, it's considered that a B2 or B8 use could conflict with LP 28 in that it could cause environmental impacts or conflicts between nearby uses when considering the agent of change principle. As such, alternative employment floor space is considered more appropriate in this location, and in order to ensure consistency with the PIA designation, it is considered that employment generating uses covered by the specific use class EG should be maximised across the application site and should comprise a minimum 50% of the units. Furthermore, to ensure that the proposal would not result in conflict with the requirements of the nearby major town centre, it is considered necessary to limit the size of any retail A within the buildings to an area of 261 square metres or less. Overall, the development is considered to result in acceptable use, which would not cause harm to the vitality and viability of the neighbouring major town centre, or give rise to any significant off-site amenity or highways impact, and will deliver public benefits in the form of bringing an underutilised site back into use. All other material considerations have been covered in the report. Officers therefore recommend that planning permission be granted subject to conditions.
Great, thank you very much. Next up, we have those here to object. We have Al Harper. Could you raise your hand just so I know who you are? Right, hi there. And Steve Royal. Hi there, thank you. You've got 5 minutes between the two of you. Have you decided how you might split that? Great, okay. So when the lights go orange, you've got 1 minute left, and then red is stop, right? Okay, so it's the bottom right-hand button to turn it on, not the green tick.
Graham, can I ask you to do the lights, please?
Oh yeah, sorry, let's put the lights up. Sitting in the gloom.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Graham.
Okay, and then whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks. I'm here on behalf of the Churchwell Residents Group, which represents residents of Mehetabel Road, the nearest residential area to the Morning Lane buildings in this application, immediately behind the Golden Arches, which are also subject to the other planning application, item agenda 8, which has now been withdrawn. Having recently held a meeting with the 25 houses that back onto the arches, which we saw in the picture earlier, our first major concern was that there had been no consultation about any of these proposals. The same goes for the changes happening at Bohemia Place, which also have a significant impact on us all here. As far as we're aware, there's been no consultation with anyone in our area about any of this. Our overriding concern for these two applications is that the change of use to Class E allows for a whole range of different types of tenants to move in, many of whom we as nearby residents would deem unsuitable for the area, specifically food and drink outlets and the increased noise and smells from extraction units and air conditioning units that come with these trades. There will also be the inevitable Deliveroo riders coming and going all day and night, as we see in the narrowway at nearby Hackney Central. They already regularly use Mehetabel Road, Link Street and Churchwell Path as cut-throughs, and mopeds on Churchwell Path is not great. We are also concerned about the potential use by gyms and daycare or creches in the buildings and the arches. Gyms will inevitably have loud music and crashing of weights equipment, and creches and daycare facilities come with the increased potential of traffic dropping off, as we've seen happen in the nearby Olive School in the churchyard. We've already seen a large number of people using their vehicles on Mehetabel Road to drop their children off at St John and St James Primary School, despite the recent introduction of the school street scheme, which has only had a minor impact. Whilst this application only deals with the two bookend buildings, an unrestricted change to the use of Class E would potentially set a precedent for the arches under the other application, which would have a more significant impact on the residents behind, many of whom now work from home in the garden offices, which are directly beneath the rear vents of the arches in question. Excessive noise from air conditioning units in the arches has already been raised as an issue several times before with environmental health. Whilst we recognise the need for the buildings and arches to be let, as residents we already suffer with a high level of noise and smell pollution, which drifts along Bohemia Place whenever there is an outdoor event held there. There are plenty of food and drink establishments in the immediate area of Hackney Central and Bohemia Place to saturation point, And we therefore respectfully request that any businesses that fall within categories B, D and F should continue to be excluded with any amended Class E use. Thank you.
Okay, my name's Al Harper. I own and run Hackney's premier bike repair space called Bohemia Bikes in Bohemia Place. I didn't actually expect to speak today, and I didn't expect to get 2.5 minutes, so it's not a formal speech or prepared. I think I'm here to sort of echo some of those sentiments that Steve's mentioned, particularly around the lack of consultation and the fact that this does create some kind of precedence. Although I am part of Hackney Central panel and have been knocking on the door of the sort of Hackney Central plans for quite a few years, I feel there's not really a very transparent approach to the entire planning for the area. And this is the block of real estate which is already renovated to the level at which you could end up with perhaps the highest price rents in the area. Obviously, Bohemia Place itself, if we just look at one that's adjacent, that was designed to be a daytime economy space. It did have an increase in the A3, A4 class usage, which has now been exceeded already. And there's a danger that with a broad E-class, that continues. I think we realise that Hackney's already pretty well catered for in terms of fast food outlets, bars, perhaps some clubs and things like that. So I think I'm speaking on behalf of the kind of daytime economy, and I'm the only daytime economy person on Bohemia Place out of those 21 arches there, which is sometimes a tough place to be in terms of supporting that type of sector. And then I think there are some other bigger issues, obviously either side of the arch space. We have an open arch space to the east side of these of the proposed development plan. And they were proposed to be a Europcar car park, which would bring in a huge amount of journeys, and perhaps allowing the general E-class use means that, 1 minute, right? No, done. Oh, all right. So the final sweeper is that there's also this massive levelling up amount of money coming into Hackney, which is huge and significant. And surely this should all be put together by the council as part of a broader plan for the area.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, sir. And then speaker supporting the application is Penny. Thank you, from Alison Young. Penny, you also have 5 minutes as when you want to start.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to reiterate that this application we're talking about tonight just relates to the two bookend buildings. I appreciate that the speakers have talked about the arches, but that is a separate application. Obviously, the purpose of this application is to widen the range of uses that can occupy the building in order to secure new tenants, create jobs and attract investment. Objectives that I'm sure you can agree with is what we need to be looking at for Hackney. The history of the development on this site has obviously been well documented. The development was completed in 2018, and as your officer said, the eastern building has never been occupied despite extensive marketing, and the western building, or the Nike building, was vacated in December 2022. As set out in the submitted marketing material, no interest has been expressed in the eastern building, with tenants identifying the limitation to the sale of clothing and clothing accessories as set out in the July 2014 consent previously mentioned. The change of use will enable the creation of a broad range of employment opportunities across a variety of sectors, providing jobs that are available to local residents in accordance with policy LP31 of your local plan and meeting space objective 4. In terms of the management of any potential future occupiers, your officer has recommended conditions which will ensure there is no detrimental impact on public safety and amenity, and seek to address, including the requirement for a delivery service and refuse plan, limiting loudspeakers to internal only, a limit on noise from plant, and ventilation details to be provided of any cafe or restaurant use, which, as the conditions controlling the development, in the event of a breach, the authority would be able to take enforcement action. So you can be reassured that the development will operate in accordance with those conditions. A limit on the size of the unit for any retail sales has been proposed of 261 square metres, which is the floor plate of the eastern building, which is the smaller of the two. We would ideally like that to be amended to 378 square metres, which is the footprint of the Nike building, which is the larger of the 2 units. Now, I understand why the officers have put that restriction on, but in order to facilitate a wider potential to let that unit, we would like to see a slight increase, if possible, to that minimum unit size. We acknowledge that the site is located within a priority industrial area where the council seeks to secure the employment uses. Obviously, since this development has come forward, those uses have not been provided. Prior to the redevelopment of the site, there was circa 700 square metres of land for employment use. There's a proposed condition at the moment that will look to have 50% of the floor space for the office use, rather than using use classes. We would like to propose that that is 41%, which I know is a subtle difference, but again, it relates to the footprint of the 2 buildings. And we've potentially got a tenant interested in taking the whole of the west building, the Nike building, which is the larger building, which would mean there'd be 59% of the floor space not in office use. So if members are minded, we would like to see that change to enable 1 unit to come forward with a tenant that is currently interested in that unit to then hopefully bring forward subsequent tenants in the other units. I'm sure that you're in agreement with your client, with my client and your officers, that these units need to be occupied and provide important local employment and wider economic benefits in accordance with policy. We've worked with your officers to agree these conditions. However, there's a slight amendment we would like in terms of the restriction on retail floor space and the provision of employment floor space.
Great, thank you very much. Members, questions? Has anyone got any?
Yeah, great, go ahead.
Councillor Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. I think if I could start with Alex, isn't it? Sorry. Just, I mean, I've been on the planning committee quite a long time, but I don't think I've ever seen a change of use come forward with so little detail about what's going to be there. Could you maybe explain a little bit more about why we haven't asked beforehand what they're planning to? I mean, I think I've got an idea, but just if I could hear it from you. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I guess what we have to consider is the new use classes order. So basically the only reason that this application is coming forward is because there is a condition on the original permit which was looking at that restricted the use to a very specific type of retail use. And the reason behind that was because this permission was granted, as I said, based on a set of unique circumstances that was the provision of the fashion hub. So that is why a large area of employment or industrial floor space was allowed to be lost as part of this overall regeneration scheme. If that restriction wasn't included, the A1 use class has now been revoked, and so it falls within an E use class. So without that restriction on, the applicant would be able to change into an E-use class without, or it would already be an E-use class without us assessing it. So as part of this, that's part of the consideration. Another consideration we have in terms of marketing evidence, given the existing restrictive retail use, which is what the application has been marketed as, we don't actually have any marketing evidence to in regards to the proposed E-uses, because the buildings haven't been used within that E-use class to date. And so given the, I guess, the broadness of that E-use class and that has been opened up in 2020, and all of the uses that fall within that kind of, which range from, you know, the display of retail, which was A1, A3 restaurant, financial services, the indoor sport, provision of medical on the creche, and office uses. That use class was created because these uses are generally considered not to cause a large amenity impact within, given the nature of these uses. So they all do fall within that same use class. So in terms of providing any greater level of detail, it would be hard, firstly because of the marketing that hasn't been able to go on because of the restricted use that exists, but also because of the broadness of the class, that if we were to grant this unconditionally, they would be able to change within that use class.
Do you want to come back on that one, Councillor Joseph?
Could I? Can I follow
please
up?
go.
Thank you. Just going back to when it initially changed and became A1, Obviously, this sort of development received some public funding, I believe, after the riots, and has become quite controversial because, as you say, it has remained derelict. So there's a lot of public concern about it, and I think maybe one of the reasons the community are quite concerned is because that EU's class is so broad. They've really got no idea what might end up there. So, are there any stipulations, considering that public money was used to develop this initially?
So I probably think that actually the question is probably what are the conditions on the original application around the
Okay, so,
national-
okay, so in terms of the original conditions as opposed to the proposed conditions now?
Yeah, I think are we changing? Are there any conditions changing as a result of this? Or is there-
Yeah, but yeah, there are. So basically, this is not, unlike the Arches application that was going to be considered, this isn't a Section 73 application, so it is a wholly new application, but there are a number of conditions that are being carried over, and they include the conditions that weren't, that from my research have not been discharged yet, but also conditions that could give rise to amenity impacts. So I think the pertinent ones to discuss and to mention would be the delivery and service and refuse management plan, because as objectors have been concerned about potential deliveries, that is something that we also, without knowing what the potential uses would be, we can't make an assessment on that. But once a tenant is proposed or has kind of agreed to a lease, we will need to see details of that, so that ensures that we will be able to consider those amenity impacts once a tenant has kind of signed a lease. It's also, I think, pertinent to mention that hot food takeaways and public houses and drinking establishments don't fall within the EU's class, so they cannot be included within these buildings. So if they were to come, again, it's probably not an issue with the floor plates of this size, but that would be a breach of the condition because they do not fall within EU's class. Other conditions that we have included and carried over include a noise condition, which looks at limiting it to 5 decibels above background noise. And in terms of conditions that we've added, it's about amplified equipment, because we are aware that there is some, given the broadness of the use class, that there is some ambiguity as to what is going to go into those places. So we have limited, because obviously we're aware of potentially gyms that do play louder noise, so we have limited sound amplifying equipment that may not be used externally, and we've also limited in amplified music internally to be restricted to background levels only. So added is a primary cooking condition. So if a potential EEB use class was to come in, we would need to see details of that submitted prior to that use being occupied. So again, we would at that point of a potential tenant be able to consider those amenity details in greater detail at the time, because there are no external changes proposed as part of this application, and given that these buildings were built with the idea of restricted retail, they don't actually have any external equipment in regard to cooking. So if they were to be installed, if a restaurant was to come in, we would require details of those be submitted, so we could consider the impacts of those specific, I guess, potentially higher amenity impact uses at the time.
Can I just follow up on just the use class, and why is this use class kind of acceptable versus any other use class within policy as it stands?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of things to look at here. So obviously it is within a priority industrial area where the first uses that we would seek here would be B2 and B8 uses, considering, and that's in line with LP 28, considering the location, the design, the floor plates of the building, and the adjoining, I guess, potential amenity impacts on neighbours. It's considered that they're highly likely to conflict with other parts of LP 28, which highlights that any potential industrial uses shouldn't conflict with nearby existing uses. So it's considered that instead of, I guess, industrial uses, other employment generating uses, which are supported by LP 28, which seeks to maximise employment generating uses, it's considered that if we were to limit this use class or this application to require at least 50% of the floor plates or the floor area to an employment by with that condition. It is a flexible approach that we have taken, given the existing situation. And given that up until now, again, as I've said, there's been no marketing evidence that has been able to be produced or reviewed by the council, wouldn't be acceptable in this location.
Great, thank you. Councillor Sadek, and Councillor Young, and Councillor Joseph.
Thanks, Chair. The objectors mentioned, well, both of them, points around consultation and sense of nearby residents and business owners and so on being included in the conversation. And you mentioned the delivery service and refuse management plan that would come forward down the line. I just wonder whether there's any, how likely it is that the council would engage with in any form of consultation or engagement with regards specifically to that plan, given that delivery has been highlighted as a particular risk.
And can I just ask the general question about whether there was or was not consultation if there wasn't lines in that?
Yes, so in terms of the consultation as outlined within the officer's report, we did send letters to all of the neighbouring occupiers. 164 letters were sent out looking at our records, and there was also a site notice erected. So in terms of our statutory duty to carry out consultation, the council has carried out its consultation in line with that statutory duty. In terms of the refuse management plan, it is put on as a condition, and so in terms of the statutory requirements to consult with objectors, that's not a statutory requirement that we have, but if that's something, I know that in the past things have come back to committee where there's been controversial things and if further detail wants to be seen, so that's something that the committee has done in the past if that's what you want to do, to kind of ensure that there is consultation with objectors.
Thanks very much. Councillor Young, I think I said next.
Okay, you can stop me if I'm not allowed to ask this, but I'm a bit concerned that we're looking at the end buildings without looking at the arches. I recognise that they're two separate planning applications, but I also hear that if you do this, that's setting a precedent for what's in between. One of the considerations is the buildings around, and I'm very aware that this entire site is one that the council has taken an interest in the past, has provided or supported the provision of public funding for, and is of concern to the wider community.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was why the plan was to bring both of the sites to committee at the same time. Unfortunately, that didn't go ahead, and the applicant for the Archer site would wishes to have further consultation with the council and discussion. So we're continuing on that. Again, the precedent in planning doesn't exist. It's on a site by site basis. So and we consider all applications on their merits. So and they are currently two different applicants, two different agents. So they are being considered. Whilst the context of it is a consideration, and the decision of this committee will be a consideration as part of it. It doesn't, the context of the two sites, while similar, do have their differences, and we are aware of that when making an assessment.
I think, sorry, can I just, I think the point about them being two different applicants is obviously pertinent, but Graham, did you have anything to add generally?
No, I think the case officer's covered all the things I would have picked up on. Question to come my way, thanks.
Great, thanks.
So recognise obviously that they are technically two separate applications. However, to the local community, including the people whose houses back onto them, of course, they're affected by the whole. So how does this fit into any surrounding policies or plans, proposals for this area as a whole? How does this application sit within?
Yeah, within the context of.
Yeah, within the context.
Are there other use classes, similar use classes sit along the road?
I'm trying to bring in the wider context, but I recognise, context is relevant, isn't it, as a planning?
Yeah, so the context is relevant within the area. There's nothing that I'm aware of. Obviously, the Hackney Central major town centre plan is being progressed at the moment, but this site it's kind of unique in its own way, because the original scheme was for a loss of employment generation. It was in a priority office area at the time, so this was brought forward for a specific set of circumstances, and that was because of the regeneration funding and because of the proposed economic boost it was thought that this would bring to Hackney. So it kind of sits very differently from whilst the context is important, it sits very differently from other sites, and it is, I think, a unique one in Hackney that may not be similar to any other sites around it.
Okay, can I ask something about a totally separate question? Residents mentioned that the question of noisy air vents, and you've said obviously that, you know, if there's going to be increased air conditioning and so on, that would require sort of further consultation or consideration. But experience is that that hasn't happened in the past, and that they've already had noisy air conditioning, and when they've complained, nothing's happened. Can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I have contacted our environmental health team in regards to the existing situation on site, and I am aware that I think that the arches haven't been sealed, so that is conversations that we're going to have ongoing with the applicants of the Archer site. It's again, it's not so relevant for these sites because they are not bordering the rear gardens of Mehetabel Road to the rear. So those ones, my understanding is those environmental health conditions haven't been associated with the Nike building, and obviously the vacant building hasn't caused any immediate impacts. But I think that's a conversation that to be had when we look specifically at the arches.
And I suppose that our job is to make sure that things are policy compliant, and then enforcement comes afterwards, I suppose. Okay. I had Councillor Young, then I had next. Councillor, go on, Councillor Joseph. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is for Penny. Hello. Obviously, we are quite concerned about what goes there. I mean, ideally, it would be great to have something for the community, something affordable. You mentioned some tenants lined up or some ideas that you already had. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit for us.
So I think as set out in the marketing material, we've had interest from Pure Gym, Nike building. And that is the concern because that building is more than 50% of the overall floor space. So that would not be possible with a condition requiring 50% to be used or BG. It would be 59% of the floor space in the non-office use. And then the east building would be the 41%. So that's kind of why we've suggested that, because of where conversations are with Pure Gym at the moment. So this has been the challenge with marketing the site. Obviously, it's very restricted, so you market it in accordance with the restrictions, but you always get somebody else who comes along and says, well, you know, could I take the unit? And part of this application is to enable those inquiries to come forward without the need for another application for each person who inquires, because it just creates more certainty for the incoming tenant who knows that they could occupy the space, and also to the developer and the community knows what is like. That's why I was throwing lots of figures around. I'm sorry if it made sense in my head. I'm not sure if it came out like that.
So I suppose there are a couple of requests that came through from you in your opening statement around size, and you've got the addendum here which specifies new size. Did the officers have these requests in and decline them? Are they new requests? Can we just? I think we should probably stick on this for a while because we need to make a decision about whether.
So just firstly to talk to in terms of the retail unit sizes. So that was revised in discussions once the kind of floor plate areas were known. So in basically LP 32, which is the town centre policy, restricts or requires that retail outside of major town centres is restricted to below 200 square metres. Again, we have applied this policy flexibly based on the size of the floor plates. So if that condition was put on at 200 square metres, it would result in not whole air floor plate of the eastern building being able to be rented. So it would result in the majority of it, and then 30 square metres being unable to be used. So for reasonableness reasons based on further evidence and further conversations had with the applicant, that was increased to 261.
So why is it 261 and not the sort of 278 or whatever that?
So that was 378. So
378, right.
so in terms of the policy, that's considered a much larger departure from the 200 square metres. It was considered up to 261 is a reasonable for the council in regards to the policy, but 378 square metres is almost double the requirement outside of our town centres, and we haven't been provided, and there's been no demonstration of kind of a sequential approach that would look at whether there are no suitable premises within the major town centre that would then allow for these larger retail units outside.
Okay, and then, sorry, from the applicant, there was one other, please do feel free to respond to that, and then there was one other request for change that I can't remember.
No, the unit floor space, that was so our figure had come from the west building because that's the footprint of that building, which is a large building rather than the two. So that's those two figures. And then the other figure is the 50%, which is condition, I can't remember what.
And what you're doing to that condition, sorry?
So that's the condition that is condition 7.1.9 in the report, which has got no less than 50% of the floor space shall be used for EG. And that's the one we would like to seek no less than 41%, because that is, the buildings aren't 50-50 in terms of their footprint across the site. One's 41%, one's 59%. So by putting 41%, it would enable the larger building to be let to the tenant that's lined up, and then secure the smaller of the two buildings, which would still be a significant uplift compared to what was previously on the site, enable that one to come forward for EG.
Okay. What's that impact? What would that?
So just in terms of our response to that, this has kind of come about as part of developing conversation. So again, whilst the marketing report submitted did say that there was interest from Pure Gym, we hadn't received anything else in terms of where these kind of discussions were at, whether it was just an interest or whether it was close to being finalised. So the position that the council has taken is that we received information yesterday evening. It wasn't soon enough in time for committee for it to be considered as part of this, and to whether that would change our position. But basically the position on what has been submitted is that the land is in a priority industrial area. The original floor space was lost as part of the unique and exceptional circumstances. We've been flexible in providing a 50% limit on the office floor space, because the marketing evidence to date to show that that's not a viable use within this area, because obviously, as Penny has mentioned, there's been no real marketing to date of this specific use. In a priority area, we want to maximise the amount of employment as much as we can, the amount of employment generating floor space. So we landed on the 50% in response to the existing conditions.
Yeah. So reduction to 41% would be a sort of loss of against policy?
Yes, yeah, in terms of in a priority industrial area.
But may make it easier for the applicant.
Exactly. It's just we didn't receive the information in time to review as part of this.
Okay. So I suppose the committee does have the opportunity, if it wants to, add the conditions on. I mean, I think on the first one, it seems pretty clear about why, in terms of the 260, why that is in place. I suppose the latter one is relatively interesting because it, as set out, you have a material loss of sort of 9% of what you would with EG, but it might, in the long term, 0% of 50 is a lot less than 100% of 41. Did anyone have any kind of questions of that? It's not prejudging where we will end up on the application because we haven't got to the conclusion yet.
I suppose
Councillor Young?
it feeds in for me to the question about whether we have the power to send this away and say we want to Arches.
It's two different applications from two different people, so.
I understand that, but the officers wanted to bring it together for the obvious reason that it sits more easily to see all of them together because the context is relevant. And the
Well,
use
context
and
of
the-
everywhere is relevant, isn't it? So,
Yes.
and of every application, but you don't need to see the route to do that, I don't think.
I just wanted to know legally whether we could do that if we wanted to.
We can defer it, absolutely. That's great.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, within the Planning Act, every application has to be assessed on its own merits. So if you're affording weight to the application alongside another planning application, you're outside the planning regulations and the law on it. So, you know, even if we had the two items at the same committee, we'd be making decisions on them as separate applications. The context is very helpful, but we can't consider the two together. We have to consider each of these on their own merits.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Councillor Young. Sorry, Councillor Joseph.
That's okay. I just wanted to ask about the boundary with Hackney Central, the major town centre.
Sorry, are you moving on to something separate or?
Well, I don't think so. I think it's kind of relevant because I'm wondering if the stipulation on the maximum space would have applied if it was in Hackney Central town centre, or would you have allowed? Because it's very close, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, so
Very close.
basically that stipulation is based because it is outside the town centre, because we want to ensure that, but basically the reason that that policy exists is to ensure that uses that, you know, large retail, say sites like Tesco are going into retail, into major town centres, which is where they've been designated based on land use studies, aren't being taken out of those town centres and re-provided in different locations, which would then reduce the vitality and the viability of the town centre.
I do understand the premise, but because it's so very close to Hackney Central, could we not potentially consider it as part of the town centre? Just a slightly expanded one.
I guess the town centre, when the borders are drawn, that they're considered, and there would be a reason why it doesn't fall within that town centre. So you
Yeah,
can't
I mean,
just.
in the policy frameworks, there are defined borders of where these things lie. So great.
Yeah, it's exactly that. You know, the town centre designation wasn't something someone, you know, took quite a lot of research and evidence base go into defining all areas in a local plan. And obviously, in the case of every designation, somewhere's just outside and somewhere's just inside. So in that context, you know, we need to bear that in mind. You know, there are reasons it's not in designated centre. It's not just because it seems like the end should be where it ends. But then in terms of policy, that refers specifically to town centres. So yeah, I think probably fairly shaky ground to say, well, it's close enough, we can disregard this policy. It's a material consideration, but I wouldn't afford that much weight to it, given the evidence base behind the designation.
Thanks. Okay. Sorry, I still had to come to Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. I don't have any problem with the issue of change of use. There have been enough restrictions put in place that it's office hours, it cannot be a bar, it cannot serve food, all about music as well. My beef with this, and we talked about safety, and whilst there are changes to entrances to this, is that I walk past the building, the building that's never been used on the east, and it is the most unpleasant, dangerous pavement. I have the unfortunate, you know, a necessity to walk along, and I am almost kind of gobsmacked that it was allowed in the first place for a new build to have a pavement, and that's a long pavement, a major route, a major thoroughfare for pedestrians, but to actually walk on it, I find difficult as a pedestrian to pass another pedestrian. You are squished in between, you know, traffic and that wall. I just am stunned that there's no consideration as to that as what a pavement should be. It surely must fail anything, because if you had anyone in a wheelchair, you cannot pass anybody. You're stepping into the road. And it just seems an opportunity that it's a building that has failed entirely, and it's created a really unpleasant experience for people on that pavement. And if there was anything that the applicant could ever do at this point to say in these negotiations, because I don't care about the percentage, I'd rather have an active office than these dismal, empty, abused signs of desolation and failure. I mean, I quite like the goal, but it just.
Okay,
makes
come on,
sense.
let's get to the question.
Well,
Is
can we
there's
do
a-
something
with-
about it? It's like, maybe, you know, can we not give our officers not the freedom, but the ability to negotiate whatever these percentages are for active office versus active something else? Don't care, I want to see these used, but if there was nothing to, I just want to flag it. because
So I
it's
think the
horrid.
relevant question is, who owns the footpath? Is it within the site, is that footpath within the?
So it doesn't fall with, so this site, the boundary is defined. I can get it up on the, but the boundary is
You may find,
defined
councillor Webb, that the council owns the footpath.
literally just around the buildings. So the footpath doesn't fall within the remit of the application.
So,
But it doesn't.
second? Well, we're not changing the application is not to change the shape of the building, it's change of use. The council owns the footpath,
Yeah.
TfL owns the road. So I suggest that,
It's
you pick out
just
the street scene.
from, can we not segment the
You can, but it's got
experience
nothing to
outside?
do with this
And if
application,
it was
I'm afraid,
ever,
so
ever
that'll do,
possible,
come on, we've had it.
if
No,
they would
Councillor
prepare
Webb.
to make a public realm
It's,
offer of improving the pavement, I think we should flag
this
it.
is a change of use application, it's not a, construction application, so.
I just say
Um,
it would, sorry to butt in, but any condition would obviously have to be sufficiently related to the development. And if we have somebody in highways who could attest to that and has some form of highway improvement works that are needed as a result is proposed, then we could look to include it. But so far as I know, no such condition has been deemed necessary. So it's difficult to impose it at this stage, unless you want to that to be considered.
No, my apologies, butting in. Thank you. Sam's absolutely correct about conditions. Obviously, there would need to be a justification for there to be some kind of need to improve those highway works that needs to arise from this development. Now, the permitted use was the old A use class, so retail, which probably of all the E use classes, which is the group it's now in, is probably the one that would have the highest trip generation. So it would be very hard to argue that this is going to generate more footfall and users for that pavement. So, yeah, I think if anyone can agree that that's a very poor piece of public realm, but it's very hard to argue that this development in and of itself is a necessity for something to be done as a result of this application.
Chair, can we ask for the minutes to note that this has been raised,
You
even though it's
can,
not
but I
relevant
think,
to this
I think
application?
more issue for ward councillors and that road. You're not going to move the building, unless the applicant says. We might propose it and then lose it at some point in a legal setting. Right. Okay. But I do. Yeah, we can absolutely note it. Those people who were on the planning committee at the time of passing this application meet their maker.
Sorry, Chair, just to say I've got a record of it, and obviously it's on the recording, but obviously I've got a record of all sides. So obviously, the point made about the fact that it's not to do with the
Noted.
application.
Sorry, Councillor Potter, I haven't come to you yet. Do you still have a point to raise before Councillor Joseph? Yours been dealt with? Okay, great, thank you. Great, we've got Councillor Joseph.
Sorry, Chair, I was just briefly going to say that unfortunately, it was basically derelict. So even though it was retail, nobody actually went in it. So presumably anything that they put in there is going to have a bigger footfall.
I went in it, I bought things from it.
But you're the only one, Chair. It's never been, so whatever goes there will presumably attract a higher number of people than currently, and there may well be
But the
issues
use
with
class, but the use class was the use class, so there's no change. You know, whether it's not up to us about whether it opens and how many people do or don't go. We are talking about use classes. We're not guaranteeing football. We're talking about football within use classes. Okay.
Didn't the officer say if there was a justification or suspected increase in footfall, it might be justified?
So in terms of the footfall, that was considered as part of the previous application. So I guess, as the chair has said, the buildings aren't moving. This is just a change of use application, and the trip generation of the scheme as a whole was considered as part of the previous use and was considered acceptable with the potential of all the buildings being occupied. So planning permission is granted, again, we can't guarantee that it's going to be implemented, but when a scheme is assessed, it's based on that scheme being implemented. So the trip generation for the site as a whole was considered as a part of the previous application. It was found to be acceptable. In terms of the change of use, it's not considered likely that this would generate a higher trip generation regardless of what is on site currently. So we're comparing it to the previous use.
Thanks, yeah. Two questions. One of them follows on from something I think Councillor Webb was saying, a separate point, it's the pavement issue. Thinking about this question of the allocation of space within the building and how they can, whether this 50% divide can be varied. Is it possible to create a situation where officers have discretion to pursue the 50% split, and if it does transpire as it isn't going to be viable for the tenant that's in mind, or possibly others as well, that you would have the ability to vary that to something sensible in order to, as soon as possible, without needing to come back?
So absolutely. So if a Section 73 application came in to vary the application that had adequate justification that had been provided to the council that we could assess and that would change our assessment of the scheme, then that is an option that could be considered. Again, Section 73 this is not a major scheme. A Section 73 doesn't automatically come. It would depend on the level of interest at the time. So if there was a high level of public interest in that application, depending on what came in, if this, again, this is hypothetical, we would need to bring that to committee. So it really depends on the time, but the scale of the application itself wouldn't necessitate a Section 73 application needing to be considered.
So we delegated. So I think on that basis, generally, if we just pop back, I think we don't need to condition it now. If they want to change it, bring the evidence and officers can deal with it. And if it needs to come back to us, then it will. Okay. Any other questions? Sorry, Councillor Sadek, since you've got the
it's just to echo the point that Councillor Young has made around the wider context, and I appreciate that they are two different. The arches in these buildings are two separate applications, but I think that the business that's been mentioned, Pure Gym, highlights for me, illustrates quite well the reason why we're doing them together, or at least the council should be able, you can't necessarily control when they come to planning, or perhaps you can, but a gym being in the major building on this site and how that fits with the slots along the arches, that to me seems incredibly relevant. And I know we don't have control over the letting of the commercial premises or anything like that, but it just seems to me to be much more desirable for this to be considered at a stage when they can be heard together. And with some insight into the.
I think also there's no reason why they would be coming together other than, if they're owned by two different applicants, then the other applicant could come in 3 years' time. You can't stop one applicant from bringing an application just because you want to see, just in the way that you can't stop someone who wants to do a dormer sort of renovation on their roof because someone 3 years' time might want to do one later on. So you have to do it within the policy framework that you have available to you, and considering the wider context. But you have a body of policy, you've got frameworks, and this is a change of use within that. So do you have a further answer?
Yeah, just to add to that, I was just going to say it was actually a coincidence that they were just submitted at the same time. So the fact that they were being at the same time is not because it's been designed like that. So we were considering them. We have to assess the applications that come in based on the information that we have and reach a determination at the time when, with the information that we have, it came to a point where with the arches, we were not ready, or the applicant wanted further discussions about that. And so that's where that application was withdrawn.
Can I just come back on that? I totally take the point that you're both making. And if it were just things that were next door to one another, I would not be saying anything. But the fact that this is part of, if not now, then at the beginning at least, a redevelopment scheme that was one, and the building are designed in the same way. The exterior design of these buildings, to the public eye at least, they're part of the same thing. Is there no other lever within the planning framework available to the council to enable them to consider this holistically? Applicants, I just wondered if there's if that's a sort of formality that there's a different applicant and actually the ownership of the buildings is consistent across the whole plot.
I can jump in just to answer part of that. I mean, development of a nearby site, so a sort of contemporaneous application, is capable of being material in what you're considering. It's then for you as decision makers to apply the weight that you want to the application, and it's at a non-consented stage. You know some of the details of the application. What weight, as I say, you attribute to that is to you, and if you see that as harmful, you balance that against everything else that you've heard this evening. So yes, you can consider it, but then there's that slightly grey area, or not in a way, where you still consider each one on its merits. You can't require them to be heard together because they're separate units. But if you see the impact of the two in the way that they relate to each other as significant, then you can consider that.
Yep, Karen.
One further follow-up on that, and it really goes to the word that you've just used. I'm not necessarily saying that, well, my instinct is that they are relevant to each other, the two. I suppose I'm asking for a steer from them. They are closely related to each other.
You've got a steer from the council because you have from the planning department, because you have the report in front of you. And you've got the recommendation from the officers.
Which, yeah, okay. Well, if you can come back on that point now, notwithstanding that, that would be helpful, I think, because it may be that you just, specifically on these points, which I don't think are covered on this specific issue in the report, whether you think we're just, barking up the wrong tree.
Yes, so in the context, and it feels like I'm just reiterating it, but the context is important always in a planning application, but we consider each individual application on its merit. The ownership of specific land is not a relevant consideration within or who owns a land is not a material consideration that we consider as part of an application. Specifically when there is a change of use, so if an applicant wants to come in with applicants or two different applications, they're able to. You don't have to own the land to actually put in a planning application. So the applicant could be different, but the owner could be the same. But that's not something that we can make an assessment on. We are assessing the change of use that is put before us as part of the application.
Okay. The questions, Councillor Young?
No, but I guess we understand that. No. I noticed that there are two separate applicants, and they appear on the face of it to be genuinely distinct. I've got one more question, which came from the written objections.
Yep.
Which was very concerned about the building remaining gold. Is
they
that
want it to
relevant
remain
to?
gold, or they don't want it to remain gold?
I think they. Oh, okay.
Oh, that's the other one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Forget it.
I've got a couple. Can I just do a couple before I bring Councillor Joseph in again? Just in terms of the use class allowing restaurants, not takeaways, not bars, but restaurants. Given there was a through and using the cut through, what is the difference between a takeaway and a restaurant that has takeaway services such as through delivery?
So basically, in terms of the definition in the use class order, so restaurant is a sale of food and drink for consumption mostly on the premises. So that's a more traditional restaurant than you would see. Obviously, with the rise of delivery, that has changed the way that some restaurants function. But in terms of for the purposes, I guess, of the planning system, it's a traditional restaurant that would be kind of tables and chairs with seating and less of, I guess, the hot food takeaway where you come in, you just have a counter, there's no tables and chairs, and it's purely set up for a takeaway service.
Is it possible that the restaurants could do a delivery service?
Yeah,
And is it
that's
with-
not specified, I guess, in our use class.
Fine. And is that a condition that we could impose, or is that?
So I'm just looking at this in the wording of the delivery and service management plan to see if it might be caught up in there.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, as Rob was just saying, if takeaway becomes the main part of the use of the site, then it would actually be a different use. So it wouldn't be a restaurant anymore. It would be a hot food takeaway.
Yeah, I suppose the change in the models of the Uber Eats and delivery is that they started off being actual restaurants, and they're now much less actual restaurants. They tend to be sort of dark kitchens and stuff.
Yeah.
But could we? So we could do something during the plans that will come later. Is that right? Or?
Yeah. So there's two things that we're going to, that I think will be relevant to the condition. So there's the delivery service and refuge management plan that will kind of take into account the way that the deliveries of service of the sites. We've also got the primary cooking conditions, so any external plant that is to be installed, we will, I guess we'll have more of an understanding of the tenant once those applications come in, and the site, I think, will be further progressed in terms of tenancy. In terms of delivery drivers, I guess we can't, the planning system is not there to limit the way that people run their businesses, so it falls within an acceptable, within a restaurant class, and we've considered that acceptable. We can't say you can only have, and also it wouldn't be an enforceable condition to include something to say you can only have one delivery driver. That's not something that.
But you might be able to do something within the management plan afterwards, potentially.
Potentially, but again, I think they've come.
Sort of around motors.
Yeah, so we could look at the way that the deliveries come to the site, and that could be considered as part of the green service management plan, and how that would, and how the area around it would be used.
Okay. Can we ask the officers do that when they're looking at the management plan? Then is that okay?
Yeah, that could be.
We don't need a condition for that. Is that a request?
No, I think
Just emphasise that so the Class E, the restaurant aspect of Class E is consumption principally on the premise. So as soon as sort of primary use falls away from coming off the premises, it'll fall into a different use class.
Yeah. But I suppose that's, what's principally meaning that sort of, if you get to 49% of your businesses being sent away on mopeds and bicycles, that's still not principally, I suppose, if it's 51% internal.
Enforcement officer. It's a matter of fact and degree, and it depends very much on the circumstances, which can be a variety of things. So it might not necessarily be the frequency of deliveries or the extent of deliveries. It might be a combination of a number of people come in. It might be like a sort of portion of business. It might be whether it's causing an element of disturbance. It's all sorts of factors that can come into it. But we've got a pretty good enforcement team. They make the right decisions. Are always one at appeal. So if there is a change of use that they're looking into, I'm confident that they'll be able to ascertain and fall on the right facts to make a decision on fact and degree.
Okay, fine. But if we can ask officers just to consider that in the delivery and the management plan, that'd be great. Okay, fine. Councillor Joseph?
Yeah, just following on from that, I just wondered, is there any review mechanism that's possible to kind of set the objectors' minds at how things are going, or is that purely led through the enforcement team? There wouldn't be any opportunity to review it or to issue this on a temporary basis to see how it actually works within the site? And I've got one more.
Sorry, could you do, I didn't quite get that.
Oh, sorry. So what I was proposing or asking is if it's possible to grant a temporary change of use, say for a certain fixed period, to see how things work within that area. I'm guessing the answer is no, but
no, we have granted temporary in the past, but I think in terms of, because we're talking about very specific scenarios that are arising about specific use classes at this point in time, or specific uses within the use class, which are all kind of have been included within this use class because they are considered to be a commercial use that would have acceptable and allowable on the whole impacts on amenity and aren't going to cause a huge impact. Obviously, we have the delivery and servicing plan. I think a temporary use in this is not going to be kind of the most appropriate way forward, because if we got to an instance where someone wanted to let out the say the west building, the larger building, as an office, and they only had a temporary use, it wouldn't work, I think, within the use classes and the broadness of the use classes. So if you were looking at, and then a restaurant never comes forward, then it wouldn't be tested. So at the moment, given that we don't know the tenants coming forward, I think that could be problematic in that it may not get us to a situation where we've actually assessed the impacts.
Yeah, sorry, just bringing Graham. Sorry, one second.
Yeah, what the officer said is absolutely right. The other thing about commissions is, they're a planning tool that should be used quite carefully, where they normally only get used where you've got something that's got a kind of fairly fundamental contrary nature to the planning policy, but for which there's a justification for a short time. So something you might see with temporary permission is a meanwhile use. So land that's anticipated coming forward for comprehensive redevelopment, where something that's not in accordance with the development plan can be supported while you wait for that development to come forward, or something that's, a very particular use of a piece of land that's then going to end. I think lots of things you see with like major sporting events like the Olympics would have been temporary uses that aren't acceptable on an ongoing basis. But it really shouldn't get in C basis. The idea is that when you're making planning decisions on full applications that, you should be confident in the decision that's made and then stick by it. It's not really an appropriate tool in this circumstance.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Alex. Just wondering, is there any, can we ask for any affordable workspace or any community space?
Given the scale of the development, that's not a consideration in this in this instance, sorry.
Okay. I think unless anyone's got any burning questions other than the ones we've been through, I think we've given it a good run through. So, it's a change of use class going from quite a restrictive one that's clearly not succeeded, and moving on to what is a general sort of use class of the EU emissions and not allowing bars and takeaways. Are people happy to move to a vote on this? Yeah, okay. So the recommendation is to grant planning permission subject to the conditions that are set out in the report. All those in favour, raise your hands. Thank you, and that's unanimous. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who came along, thanks to officers, objectors, and to the applicant. Okay, you are free to head off. That's great. Thank you very much. Members, do you want to have a 5-minute break, or do you want to head straight into the next one? Yeah, 5-minute break.
Yeah,
That's well. If we,
give Gerard time to just.
that's fine. If we can try and start by 8 o'clock, that would be great. Thank you. All right, can we come to order? Just a reminder for members of the planning subcommittee that we've been annual compulsory planning training on the Monday the 19th, so please do come along. I've got one new member of the planning committee, Councillor Samatar, who has to do it before she can participate, and then we've got a couple of subs coming as well, so nice to see the whole committee and all for all of your planning questions as well.
Just to
Not all of
clarify,
them.
oh, sorry, Chair. Just to clarify, I understand Councillor Samatar has done some
She
planning
had done some
training.
training.
Yes, and is self-certified as well.
Yeah. Great. Right, we are moving on in that case to item 10, which is the application. So we're being led off by Gerard. Thank you, Joe. Can we get the lights?
Okay, thank you, Chair. Now, I'm just going to introduce this item, and I'd like to draw the members' attention that this application is dealing with an approval of details only, and the substantive matter of the application is not for discussion. It's not for determination by the members tonight. It is unusual for an approval of details application to be referred to the planning subcommittee. Sometimes it is at the request of the members. However, this one is referred to the committee as a significant number of objecting to this particular application have been received. This is notwithstanding that public consultation is not required for this kind of application. So the application site is the one that's outlined in, it is land to the rear of #1 Springdale Road. It is accessed through a roadway that is called Springdale Mews. There are a number of what are now residential on the west side of the Mews, which were originally built as commercial backland developments for properties fronting onto Green, as described in the officer's report. And I would also draw to the members' attention that Springdale Mews is not a public highway. Now, this application needs the approval of some of the details reserved by condition. The reason why they're all being referred up to the planning subcommittee is because they're all submitted with the same application. So in one application covering a number of details, and they refer to conditions related to detailed drawing, the construction management and logistics plan, to contaminated land, or the cultural impact assessment and tree protection, landscaping, and obscure glazing. So if I can just refer you here, these are of the development showing the elevations, and contain details of the windows and doors, which were required by the details drawing submission. If we just look at the materials, I'm just showing these almost for completeness. They have been approved under a separate application. Now, the application also sought to approve the cycle store and the refuse store, which are included on the landscaping drawing. You can see almost towards the right-hand side of that drawing, there is a cycle store and a refuse store, which is going to be off the street. It's covered, it would be secure, and there is sufficient space for bins for general refuse, materials for reuse and recycling, and also to have food waste caddies. And it's the requirement, as it is for other occupiers in this location, to move the bins to the street for to the collection point on collection day. Now this drawing also shows the proposed landscaping. It's relatively low-key landscaping, however, officers consider that it represents appropriate planting for this location and this type of development. When it comes to new housing, it's not really the role of the person to dictate how people lay out their gardens. If I just quickly look at the tree protection, this tree protection plan has been reviewed by the council's arboricultural officer and considers the details to be acceptable. The proposal would require the removal of a lime tree, which is covered by a TIMO. And again, the removal of that tree by the arboricultural officer, and that is considered acceptable. The applicants have proposed a replacement tree in that location. Now, the removal of the tree is subject to a separate would be subject to a separate because the tree is covered by a TPO, and that would be dealt with by the local planning authority in the usual way for that. The application also sought approval with regards to contaminated land and the condition required investigation and measures to be ensured that the site was safe for vegetation and use, and that has been reviewed by the council's specialist officers, and those details are also considered acceptable, described in the committee report presented to the members. The obscure glazing condition, they are showing the obscure glazing on the elevation drawings. However, that's a compliance condition, so it doesn't actually need to be approved. Now, turning to the more potentially controversial aspect of the reason why this application is before the members is the construction management and logistics plan. Now, I'm sure members may recall that this was deferred from a previous additional information to be submitted to include details of the number of deliveries, the timing of deliveries, the duration of the construction project, and what have you, similar matters. And the reason why a construction management logistics plan was recommended in the first place is because it's a constrained site with a relatively difficult access. In order to ensure that there is a safe construction process for nearby to safeguard the amenities of nearby occupiers. And the thing about construction is often referred to as being a last mile problem. And with this, it is the last section, and you can see the construction route here for deliveries and things being taken away from the site would be to use Green Lanes, which is a London distributor road, to Springdale Road, and finally the last couple of hundred metres, if that, into Springdale Mews itself. Now, the construction management and logistics plan does that there would be, I think, a maximum of 80 trips in order to clear the site. The construction period would take about a year. They're envisaging an average of 3 deliveries or vehicular trips to the site daily, with the vehicles being in the mews for about occasion. Obviously, the number of deliveries and vehicular movements, they would go down over time. And it's made very clear within the construction management and logistics plan that there'd be no parking on the site available for operatives, and there's no parking available for the operatives within either the control parking zone that's located in the area in the London Borough of Hackney. So if people do need to drive up and drop off tills, they'll drive up, drop off tills, and then go somewhere else. And they've also submitted details about noise, which was presented in the addendum, and they're going to ensure that all, where engines have plants, they're going to be used, vehicles are going to be properly maintained, and they are going to minimise the generation of noise during the construction process. I say is anticipated to take a year in total. And noisy construction works are also covered by other legislation. Excuse me. Now, the construction management logistics plan has been, as a result of significant negotiations, especially between the council's transport colleagues and also our network managers. And the question that I think the members need to ask is, can the development proceed in a way that allows it to proceed? And the answer that I would put to the members is that yes, it can. And I think that's all I have to say on this. And I will then close down.
Thank you very much, Gerard. We have, in objection, we have Michael Rhymes. Are you the only one speaking on this? Yeah, in objection, great. And can I just say that the handout that was handed out is in so although it wasn't submitted, it is actually in the report. So you already have had it, and then this is just a separate one. So, Michael, you have 5 minutes from when hang on. Excuse me, sorry. I don't know why you're talking to me yet. Are you ready? So are you ready to start? The white one with the hand at the bottom. So whenever you're ready, thank you.
It's a timed 5 minutes, I promise. I appear on behalf of Hassan Hussein, and I invite the committee to refuse to discharge the conditions. There are 2 reasons for objecting. The first is that as when this application was before yourselves in September 2022, details that are required by condition 5 remain lacking. The second is that the details that have been provided show that the proposal is unacceptable in planning terms. I start with the elements required by. You have here the site plan, and I just want to make very clear that Springdale Mews is this very narrow access, barely larger than 2 meters wide. The development would require the removal of 800 cubic meters of soil, and for that reason, the development was carefully conditioned. Condition 5 required detailed documents covering a list of matters before the permission could be commenced. I'm going to focus on 2 elements that are lacking given the short time available. The first thing is any temporary road or footway closures during the construction period and how access will be maintained for the other frontages. The construction management plan simply says, if, however, there are any closures required, the relevant licenses and notice will be served to the relevant parties. To be any relevant closures. If there are, we don't know what will be closed, for how long, or its effect on access. And logically, closures will be required. The site is not connected to the mains drainage system. That emerges from the applicant's documents. The documents recognize that excavation for underground drainage will be required, and the documents are totally silent on the extent to which those known works will impede access or how access to Springdale Mews will be maintained during those works. The suggestion that the road will be blocked for no longer than 10 minutes at a time simply cannot be correct. How can it seriously be contended that you can install a sewer installation, which we know is on the road for only 10 minutes at a time? There are other problems as well. The construction management plan refers only to an endeavour, and I quote, to ensure that access is not restricted for longer than 10 minutes. There's no binding commitment that can be enforced in event of a breach. And in any event, that applies only to goods and day-to-day construction vehicle movements. In my submission, and I am a lawyer, that is a lawyerly and carefully crafted phrase. We do not know if that will apply to, for example, the sewerage works. The second thing that we don't know is the size of the vehicle, and condition 5 required that. The construction management plan is totally vague. It says size will be kept as small as possible, but larger vehicles may be required. So in short, what is required by condition 5 simply has not been provided, and so in law, the application must be refused. I turn to the second point, which is why the application is unacceptable in planning terms. This is what they propose. You have the application and it's on the other side. The applicants recognise that the site is too constrained. So their suggestion is to take over a large part of the neighbour's land over which they have no rights. And this shows what they're going to put there. They will put in a site office, a welfare area, a guest and management parking, and the location for the deliveries. Even putting aside the lands rights issues, because the neighbours have already land for that, the welfare unit consists of 2 container ship cabins, a portaloo, and a hard standing for a generator. The smell and noise is simply inappropriate in this dense residential area, let alone so close to the neighbours you have objectives. It's simply unacceptable in planning terms. Now, on the applicant's own evidence, the number is 3 per day over the course of the 12-month construction. At least 6 such movements per day from vehicles of an unspecified size. All the users would need to manoeuvre around, likely reversing, possibly with loud alarms, from that constrained site, then doing a 90-degree turn onto the 2-metre wide Springdale Mews. This significant intensification of traffic and noise is clearly unacceptable in planning terms. The construction phase plan also says that there's going to be an exclusion zone of 3 meters from the excavations. But even on their own plan, it's clear that that's not going to be possible to be maintained. As a final point, the application is confused and confusing. The construction management plan says that there will be no dedicated parking on site, but the site plan that you have here clearly shows that there will be parking. It is wholly unclear what the applicant's plan actually is. So, in conclusion, and I realise I'm in my last minute, the elements required by condition 5 simply have not been provided. We are left out as to how access will be maintained to Springdale Mews, despite the fact that sewerage works are going to be required. The site plan is for this highly constrained site is also unacceptable in planning terms. It is telling that the applicants have had to resort to squashing everything on the neighbour's garden in order to make everything fit, and unacceptable. The final point that I wish to make is that the principle of development is acceptable if the elements in condition 5 were provided and provided to your satisfaction.
Okay.
And they have not been provided, and they have not been provided to your satisfaction. And I conclude there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can we make
I'm
sure
happy to answer any questions.
Can we make sure that all phones are on silent, please, as well? Thank you. Thank you for that, Michael. And then supporting of Sega Brambat, who's the applicant. Yeah, and then online joining remotely, we've got David Marjoram, who's the principal planner. Are you speaking together? So David, Gerard, would you mind? Oh, might we just because I've got the. Oh no, it's because I've got yeah. If you could bring it down, that'd be great, so that people can see. So David, you have. Can I just check that we can hear you? Can you just say hello?
Hello, can you hear me? Okay.
Thank you. So you have 5 minutes as and when you want to start.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is David Marjoram, Principal Planner at ELG Planning in Darlington. Speaking tonight in support of the application, and on which the case officer has already kindly outlined that the purpose of tonight's application is not to consider whether the principle of development is acceptable, as this is already established through the permission that's been in place for several years now, nor are matters such as rights of access, any covenants, or the ability to implement the consent under consideration. The application is solely focused on the discharge of conditions from an existing permission. And in granting that permission, subject to conditions, it's already been accepted that certain residual matters could be resolved satisfactorily by this mechanism, including construction management. So at some stage, the conditions will need to be discharged and cannot be unnecessarily withheld, which I'm sure it was never the intention of the committee when the application was deferred. And of course, one of the tests of planning conditions is that they have to be reasonable when applied in the first place. So having reviewed the minutes from the last committee meeting, which highlighted concerns and queries in relation to the CMP only, which was the reason for referral that I'm focusing on. And obviously that matters like contractor parking and access, noise and disturbance, etc. And the other conditions were seemingly accepted. So since the last application, a new and what we consider robust and detailed construction management plan has been produced by an experienced contractor with experience of writing such documents, complying with them, and of course developing within London. And that construction management plan has been reviewed by the council's highways officers and been considered acceptable. And just to run through some of the key CMP provisions in relation to parking, there's no parking for workers on site, and such will not be allowed. The plan that was referred to by the objector is outdated, and if members are minded to grant the discharge of the conditions, obviously they can do it, they can give the power to officers, delegate power back to officers to approve the conditions once that plan has been revised. We know parking in the surrounding area, including on Springdale Mews, Springdale Road, or within any controlled parking zones, and workers will be encouraged to use public transport in relation to dropping off, if they wanted to drop off tools or whatnot. They would be expected to leave the site thereafter and find somewhere suitable to park elsewhere. Workers will be required by the site management to confirm how they arrived at the site and, if applicable, where they parked, with spot checks carried out. And in the event of any non-compliance with CMP measures, the site management will take appropriate steps to address the situation. And if non-compliance and/or considerate parking persists, this may result in workers being removed from the job or other penalties. So in terms of disturbance and endeavouring to ensure access to and from Springdale Mews from Springdale Road is not restricted for more than a consecutive 10-minute period at any one time, the wording of the construction management plan is of course like that, because invariably where neighbours are involved, that you might have a situation where a neighbour is literally timing how long a vehicle is parked in the lane. And obviously the nature of the site's well known. Clearly there's only one way in, one way out. And there will invariably be times when access is restricted along that route, but they will do everything in their power to keep it to as low a time frame as possible. And wherever possible as well, they'll seek to ensure and seek to accommodate existing residents by moving vehicles within a shorter time frame. And once any vehicles delivering goods have unloaded, they'll be expected to leave the vicinity of the site immediately. In respect of other disturbance matters, acoustic barriers will be utilised for any particularly noisy works. They'll adhere to suitable construction hours, and wherever possible have deliveries and collections outside of the peak times. Clearly, any construction project is going to generate a level of disturbance, particularly on a constrained site such as this, and blocking access temporarily was obviously known to be going to occur and accepted. And the intention is, of course, to minimise such disturbance to acceptable levels, which is not only beneficial for local residents, but also helps to avoid potential enforcement action. To conclude, we return to the fact that development on this site has already been accepted, so must be allowed to be delivered appropriately. And the key question is whether the revised CMP addresses the previous issues. And we contend it has, for the reasons outlined. And this is endorsed by the highways officer, and also the council's environmental health officer remains satisfied. And on that basis, we feel that the conditions should be discharged. As I said earlier, we can amend the plan that the objector refers to remove any reference to parking on site. And if the CMP is approved, last thing I would like to say just quickly is the council will be able to enforce against it. The work is programmed to start in early July before the consent expires. Right. And obviously discharge will give the council.
Time's up. Thank you very much. Thank you. Right. Questions? Got Councillor Young.
Sorry, if I may.
Oh, not yet. No, thank you. Councillor Young, questions?
Just want to check, we haven't seen the construction management plan.
Yes, you have. It's all, in fact, I made sure that I circulated it all to you by email to make sure that you all had seen it, because they're all on the application, as it states in the report pack, that all the application, all the document application on the planning portal.
Okay. So
it's noted in the report pack. I reminded you.
Well, I have not seen it. I have not read it, so just so that you know, I haven't seen it or read it. So everything that I know is what's been said today and what is in the main report pack. I
No,
have
it's in the,
not
yeah, so
read
you've got the main
the
report back,
construction
and then all the actual documents on the planning portal. So we've been through this before as well, I might add.
Okay.
Questions?
I do have a question as well.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
To fully understand that planning permission is granted, we're not trying to question that. You know, that wouldn't be relevant to do. However, I do recall from the last occasion and from this occasion that clearly it's going to be a difficult site to manage, which is why this condition is there. The length of time required to block the private road, it is a private road, isn't it? Or to block Springdale Mews in order to do this sort of the digging work, which has been mentioned by the objectors. Can you tell us why the condition, the 10-minute condition, would cope with major digging works? Or how it would cope with major digging works? For example, for laying underground pipe work.
The laying of underground pipe work isn't covered by this condition. That's actually covered by the drainage condition. Any works that would be required to be done to the public highway, that's almost a separate matter. And we also have to remember that there is a Thames Water have to give a connection as of right. I've looked at the drainage plans, which are the subject of another application, and I can't state that the roadway will have to be dug up. However, I'm sure that all of the properties along Springdale Mews have some sort of drainage, which, yeah, if there were ever a leak, would necessitate works to the highway.
Sorry, excuse me. Could I just clarify?
Sorry, no,
no, but I think.
Sorry,
if I may, just because
I'd like you
was
to stop
made.
interrupting. Actually, thank you very much. I'm chairing this meeting. If I want to bring you in, I will bring you in. It's not. You have
The
had to
statement
be
was made
Excuse
that
me,
the
excuse me,
sewerage work
excuse me.
didn't need to be
Sorry.
provided under condition 5.
I'd
Could
like
I
you to-
respond to that?
I would like you to stop speaking and turn your microphone off. Thank you. Sorry, Councillor Young.
I didn't entirely understand the answer.
Okay, Gerard, can you?
Right, sorry, Councillor, if I could just clarify that this condition, the construction management and the logistics condition, sets out the parameters under which the construction will take place. And as I say, it's envisaging up to 3, maybe deliveries a day and about 10 minutes each time. However, the CMLP does acknowledge that there may be occasions when the roadway would need to be closed for longer. And unfortunately, sometimes these things do happen. The CMLP is potentially silent on whether it's going to be road closed off for a week to allow certain things, but I can't really envisage that would happen. And I would actually invite the applicant potentially to amplify that response.
Yeah.
Can we hear from the applicant on, do they need underground pipe work and how are they going to manage to put it in without blocking the road for days on it?
Yeah, the applicant.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on this point about sort of 10 minutes. I think the point that's made of the CMP is, if there's a delivery vehicle bringing building materials to the site, the idea is to have that not block the route for more than a 10-minute period. I mean, that is the aspiration. Yes, there will be some occasions when the materials are being brought to the site where there's a vehicle parked in the route of Springdale Mews for longer than that period, but the aspiration is to keep it to 10 minutes. In relation to the drainage, as Gerard said, that's covered by a separate planning condition that that hasn't needed to be brought to committee. But when we're talking about having something not parked in the access for more than 10 minutes, it's in relation to like bringing materials to and from the site. As the CMP states, you know, if something needs to be dug up and there needs to be certain measures put in place through other non-planning regimes, that will be pursued separately. I think there's a bit of a red herring there as to what we're talking about in relation to this 10-minute period.
Okay, Michael.
I apologise. I realise I've had my 5 minutes, but in the interest of fairness, it has been said by the officer and by the applicant that you don't need to consider anything to do with the sewerage works. Don't worry, there's a separate condition. Respectfully, I would invite you to read condition 5. It is very clear. Condition 5 says that no development shall take place until you have submitted and also you have approved, and this is what you must consider, whether you have approved a demolition and construction traffic management plan to include any temporary road and footway closures during the construction period. Plainly, if you are going to dig up the sewer and that is going to result in obstruction on that very narrow 2-meter access, that's what you need to know about. And we need to know how it's going to affect access. And indeed, the applicant themselves recognize this, because in their original documents to discharge this condition, they referred to condition 5, and they referred in terms to a sequence of works that would include, and I have it here, it's all online, installing main drainage runs beneath roadway and complete roadway to subbase, continuation and completion of drainage and road into the development. It is respectfully disingenuous for the applicant to now say, don't worry about sewage, don't worry about drainage, that's all a separate condition. It's plainly bang smack center in condition 5. And if you don't know how long that road needs to be closed for and how it's going to impact people on Springdale Mews, then respectfully, you cannot discharge this condition. Planning permission was granted, but only if you had approved those details.
Okay, thank you. Sam, thank you. Sam, can you enlighten us slightly on the relevancy of the sewage works under the private road, whether they're part of this or whether they're not part of this, or?
I can't on the details of the application, so I can't speak to what works are going to be carried out. I can as to the complaints about the sufficiency of evidence and the unacceptability, if you like, of what has been submitted. And that comes down to basically a matter of judgment on the part of the council. So it's for you to decide, for the council to decide whether what has been submitted is sufficient, whether what has been submitted is acceptable. And the assessment to carry out is whether the submitted plan meets the criteria of the condition. And that has been reviewed by Highways team. I think we have an officer present online who may be able to speak in more detail about it. And they've reached the conclusion based upon both those aspects, if you like, both sufficiency and quality of evidence, that it does meet the criteria. So that's it really. That's sort of the aspect. The planning judgment is a matter for the council, and it's something that we have to read.
Okay. Jared, is you or one of the team able to talk about the sewerage issue and how it relates to condition 5?
Well, yes, the CMLP as submitted, does make provision that if the road needs to be closed for any length of time, longer than the 10 minutes, the necessary license would be obtained. Now, as part of the development, one of the things that was proposed was actually an improvement to the highway. They were going to relay the highway and put some low-level lighting. Again, that involves work that may or may not restrict the use of that highway. As far as I'm aware, there's minimal vehicular traffic using that street, and in my view, the question is: are the details that have been submitted sufficient for the members to be satisfied that the development can proceed in a satisfactory manner.
And Graham, can I just ask you to come in and sort of reiterate what the basis on which we're making this decision on the reports, from the top line in terms of what is our job here, with regards to construction and but also.
Yeah, I think colleagues have covered the key points really. In terms of the decision making, as Sam said, it's about the committee's judgment based on the, based on the officer's report and the documents submitted with the application, and taking into account all the relevant considerations. Obviously not about the principle of the development that's established by the planning commission. So it's very much about just the detail of whether, looking at the reason of the condition, whether these details will avoid hazard and obstruction being caused to users of the public highway and in the interest of public safety and amenity. That's the remit. That helps.
Okay.
Word for word, I'll do my best. Well, it's slight on my regional accent. Yes, so to try and remember my thoughts. So going back from where I ended was, bear in mind the reason behind the condition being imposed, which is to avoid hazard and obstruction being caused to users of the public highway and in the interest of public safety and amenity. And members need to make a decision based on the application evidence submitted, officer's assessment, recommendation, the conversation this evening, as with all committee items. So very much think about the reason there and whether we think that information provided will address the reason the condition was imposed.
Okay. Councillor Young, and then Councillor Joseph.
So I recall when this came to us before, there was quite a lot of evidence about residents' cars and how they would get their cars in and out of this very small road. Could we ask the objectors what vehicles are there? Because it sounds to me as if the real problem here, apart from the porter cabin and so on, is will they be able to get in and out of the road that they live on whilst these building works are going on?
The answer to that is quite simple. The answer is that we don't know. And we don't know because the details that should have been provided haven't been provided. I accept that there are some matters that are a matter of judgment. Do you think that this building coheres, with the street scene? That's fine, that's a matter of judgment. But there are some things in planning law, even in planning law, that are binary. And if they haven't been provided, then you can't discharge the condition. You do not have the details of the temporary road or footway closures during the construction period. You do not have a demolition and construction plan indicating how access will be maintained for the other frontages of Springdale Mews, and you don't know the size of the vehicle. So if I were to try to honestly answer your question, the honest answer is that I can't give an answer, because at no point have they said, this is what we're going to do for the sewage works. We know they have to do sewage works, but for how long are they going to last, we don't know. We just say, if they need to do them, they'll submit all of the necessary licenses. So as a black and white matter, what you have needed to have in order to discharge condition 5 simply hasn't been provided. And that's not a matter of planning judgment, that's black and white. Now, in terms of the current use of Springdale Mews, that's my
He's
client
not
could
listed
answer.
as a speaker, I'm afraid.
Pardon me?
He's not listed as a speaker, I don't think.
Well, he can
request to
whisper.
speak.
It's just, sorry, I just personally haven't visited the site. I can't personally say how many cars use that.
He
Okay,
could
well,
have,
he
registered
registered
as a speaker. Gerard, can I ask you just to respond to that, please?
Sorry, so there are 11.
Can you?
Oh, sorry.
Gerard.
Well, in my visits to the site, I'm not aware of many people having cars and actively using them. I've walked up and down there several times. I think there's maybe one vehicle that's used parked up. It's associated with a restaurant use rather than a residential use. There is towards the southern end of the Mews, there is someone who has a collection of vehicles in a garage. Used to run a commercial vehicle repair service there, doesn't it? And I was speaking to that gentleman. He doesn't use that anymore, and he does not regard this as being an inconvenience.
Sorry, I meant more, the points made about condition 5 are that we don't know how long it'll be temporarily closed for. We don't know what the size of the trucks are. Do we need specifics around that? Or is it a case of use our judgment about whether the construction management plan manages those sorts of risks and there is a plan there? B, and if we do need it, is it there?
Well, in my view, I think that level of detail would be overly onerous on the applicant. In any construction activity, there will be some works that may involve a highway, for example, to put in drainage, and quite often they're done as expeditiously as possible. One of the highways I use in Hackney is Glebe Road, which is another narrow roadway. There's construction activity going over there. There have been times when I've had to carry my bicycle over my head to get past. Unfortunately, when development is happening, these things need to occur. But I think with other schemes, we don't ask developers to say, oh, we will be laying drains for 3 days, 3.5 days, or that level of detail is not something which is specifically required. It's much more about whether the detail that has been provided is sufficient to allow the development to go ahead without unduly inconveniencing other people. We've often seen developments proceeding where lanes within roadways are closed for months, if not years, and that's not going to be the case here. It would be a temporary obstruction.
I think it's clear that kind of construction anywhere it happens is inconvenient to some people at some points, right? So the case about the construction management plan is whether the management plan is good enough to manage the disruption that ensues from it. So questions? I've got a tree question. So I mean, it's quite subjective. I mean, I couldn't tell you how many cars move down my road. Is it completely relevant, or let's hear the answer, but can I have it really quickly? And I don't want a great speech about it.
Absolutely not. So you'll see the other residences that are there. There's a mixture of residents and businesses. They both take and make deliveries. And so Springdale Mews is in constant use by the residents and the people there. And yeah, I would just invite you to read condition 5. It's very clear what you need.
Use is quite a subjective term. So, right, Councillor Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to move on to a slightly different aspect, if that's okay. Well, I did note that in the plan, the applicant had said they'd pay particular attention will be given to the neighbouring residents. So I just wondered, maybe they could elaborate on, in their view, how they'll be given the attention. I've got a few more, but we'll start with that.
Thank you. So first of all, this is completely new to me, this whole structure and going about this. So apologies, so I'm not following the correct protocol. And also I'm stepping in for my brother, whose property this is. He's actually had a stroke, so I had to jump in the middle of things. It's not an easy time, but I've been in touch with the contractor. I've been in touch with the planning consultant, David, and I've been on site twice in the last 2 weeks. I've spoken to the other the residents, the users of the businesses down there at the end that do have cars coming in. We have their phone number on WhatsApp. We've communicated with the contractor. We've exchanged numbers, and we've said that if there's anything that's blocking you or you need to get in and out, we'll move things around for you. We'll also inform you when deliveries are coming. So the idea is to have maximum communication through a WhatsApp group or something like that, so that we can communicate with the other the other people in the road that use it. It's not the times that I've been down there.
I've not seen anyone drive in and out, so it's not high usage because it's a dead end. And it's, you know, and the other residents, I think the ones that Hassan owns, they don't have car parking or anything there anyway. So if anything, they may be getting deliveries or something, which we can accommodate for or help out with. In regards to the drainage as well, I had a conversation with the contractor. There was an idea that it's a quite narrow dig that we have to do. They've done the survey for that, and they will be putting plates over the space that they're digging, so to allow access. So that there's going to be, you know, we've been having a conversation about how we could approach that and make it easier for people to get in and out, not to have whole days blocked off or anything like that. That's not the intention. It's to try and keep it as clean as possible.
Okay, does that answer your question, Councillor Joseph? Sorry, can we have,
Would it be possible to do a follow-up on that one?
Say again, sorry.
Can I follow up on that one?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for explaining that. So you mentioned the WhatsApp group, which it seems like a good idea. I wonder if, you know, would you go further? Would you consider having a community meeting, a regular thing, just so that, you know, people do feel?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, there's also a new owner at 1E. That's they just sold that plot, and it's got planning application as well for some work as well. And we had a meeting with them on site as well. And you know, they've got space there that we're talking to them about, you know,
Okay.
as in how we can help reduce their the
Okay,
problems
let's
in the
move
road as well.
on. Okay, that's fine, thank you. Yeah, Councillor Joseph? Anything else? Second? No, let's crack through them. Can you do them short and concise and both together? And just let us know who they're for.
It was just the construction hours, so 8 to 6, 9 to 1 on Saturdays. I think these are pretty standard, but considering how close they are to the residential properties, I just wondered if there could be, I mean, something slightly shorter. And if they did want to ask to work on Sundays, would that ordinarily be granted? How much notice would neighbours have to have? Because that is a real problem when we're close to residential.
If I can just come in.
No, sorry. I'm going to go to Jared first.
Okay.
Councillor Joseph, the hours of noisy construction activity are, laid down in other legislation, and they do allow for work on during the week and on Saturdays. If noisy works take place outside of those hours, then you can contact the council's noise team, who can put a stop to it, or who can take action, investigate, and if necessary, require them to stop. So that's regarding, and I do appreciate that. Yes, it is in relatively close proximity to other residential properties. However, construction activity takes place in residential areas, and that in and of itself would not necessarily be a reason to withhold consent.
Graham?
Sorry, if I could just make.
Sorry, no, I will ask you when I want you to speak. Thank you. There's too much of this going on.
The objectors had more.
Sorry, can you mute it, please? Graham.
Yeah, just a very general point about the last couple of bits of conversation about kind of things that could be done differently. Bear in mind, this is a approval of details application. We can't put conditions on. We can't tell someone to do something differently. A commitment made in this meeting can't be secured. So we've got to bear that in mind. That it's helpful discussion. I think it's useful, but you need to be mindful that you need to make a decision on the documents that are before you.
David, on the call, you had something to say?
Sorry, I didn't quite. So we come to me there. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. All it was, I actually was speaking with the construction manager yesterday, and he said that their traditional working hours are 8 till 4. Now that is, the hours are set down, I think on one of the informatives of the commission, as Gerard says, they're controlled by other regimes. So they're actually, so that gives them flexibility to work Monday to Friday. I think it's 7:30 till 6 and 8 till 1 or whatever it is on a Saturday. But I think the intention would be to actually work slightly shorter hours than that, and not necessarily work every Saturday either. So I just thought that might be, there's no firm commitment. Flexibility, but that is the intention.
That's enough, thank you. Councillor Joseph, yeah.
Chair, just one more. I was just wondering, have you actually got the permission from the neighbour for the site office to go?
So
their
again,
land?
I think that's, what's the question around that generally? I don't want to go over there because I think the question should be answered over here. On the cabin that's part of the construction management plan that may or may not have permission to be on the land of the person behind.
It's not a matter for us or for you to consider it. Whether the developer will require a separate permission, as in a personal permission to say, yes, you can use my land, no, you can't use my land, doesn't fall within planning. So.
Yeah, so I can, as you all know, I can do a planning application for Councillor Young's back garden if I like, and if I get it, that's fine. And then she can tell me that I can't do it. So this is part of the construction management plan. But then obviously if the construction management plan is not able to be delivered, then it can't. If we grant the discharge conditions on the construction management plan that envisages use of that cabin, then that cabin is not available. What then happens?
If the developer carries out the construction works in such a way as they are in breach of the approved management plan, then enforcement options will be open to the council to enforce against that breach. What the council can't do is grant permission for the use of either the road or the land. It's not, because that's down to the owners of those respective PCL land. And if I could just add one final thing on sort of the wider subject really. Condition 5 sets out a bunch of criteria basically. And what you're doing is assessing whether what has been submitted meets those criteria. And that's it. And that what has been submitted has been obviously submitted to officers, to highways experts, and the nature of it is some of it is quite specialist stuff, but that's been provided to the expert, and they've come to you with the recommendation that what has been provided is sufficient and is acceptable and meets those criteria. I think they're on the call, and if someone could just elaborate why what has been provided is sufficient and is acceptable, that may be helpful.
Yeah.
To your.
I think I was going to bring in Kasim actually. I think he's probably the correct officer. Gerard, is that right? Yeah. Hi, Kasim.
Thank you, Chair. I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, I think much of what I was going to say, or what I kind of plan to say, has been sort of covered already. I think that the key thing that we've considered is the scale of the development. And given the scale, the information that we received has been deemed acceptable by the network management team. There's been a lot of kind of back and forth communication. There are certain details, like we've been discussing, about the sort of dwell time of 10 minutes and kind of so forth. I mean, firstly, we're principally looking at the number of public highway, I should say, and that's in terms of what the route is, in terms of how the deliveries would kind of get to site. There is no loading restriction. There's no sort of vehicle size restriction. There clearly may be kind of call it unregistered restriction for Springdale Mews, but that wouldn't be something that council sort of officers would get involved in. So yeah, I think there's obviously within any sort of construction logistics plan, there's deviation from the plan that's generally built in, that's generally acceptable. It's a live document. It's something that would kind of open up sort of communication, a two-way communication with the developer, and that often doesn't happen with smaller developments such as this. I appreciate this is a complicated site and a fairly constrained site. So it does sort of give us levers to manage the construction phase a lot better than normally it would. So the detail that I've seen, the kind of the network managers have seen, appears sufficient and it is deemed acceptable.
Okay. Other questions? Yeah, Councillor Young?
So I've seen other cases where there's been a construction management plan, it's not been followed, and it's been extremely inconvenient to all parties, both the developer and the local residents. Can I just ask, I overheard the resident saying that you hadn't actually spoken to him personally. Can I ask that you will commit to some sort of communication group that will include all residents, so that the building control team, not this team, but the building control team are not.
We're not here to be councillors. We're not here to be councillors with an S, I suppose.
But it concerns me that we're being told one thing, we're being told that communication's taking place, and hearing that it isn't.
Yes, but actually within planning frameworks, there needs to be statutory minimum of communication, and that is not statutory minimum, right? So, you know, it's nice, but it's not part of it's not material planning consideration for us on this construction management plan. Okay.
But good faith is relevant.
So
good faith is relevant.
It's actually not particularly. So because you can't do everything on good faith, you've got to do it on what we're talking about, which is plans. And, you know, if people don't follow the plans afterwards, then it becomes an enforcement issue. Other questions? Can I ask my tree question? Great. Sorry. So in terms of, we've got the arboricultural report, where's my note? So in 1.14, who's doing trees? Sorry, Jared, who am I talking to? Is it you?
You can talk to me about trees.
So on the 1.14, we're talking about the root morphology of the tree, and it may require piling to not disturb the tree, I presume. And how does that interact with the construction management plan around the noise and vibration? So if they have to use piling, how does that interact with the construction management plan?
Well, the construction management plan requires details of noise, and they have stated that they will keep it to a minimum. But there are certain activities that are associated with construction and also with installing safeguarding measures for trees that will involve noise, and that's almost an inescapable side effect of development activity. It's just whether the members are satisfied that the measures proposed to limit the noise and to keep it as I'm trying to formulate a phrase in my head, but trying to make it the least intrusive possible. Is the thing, and sometimes, noise is associated with construction activity sometimes, and I don't anticipate that piling would be a significant activity. It's not going to be happening, every day for a month. It's going to be a very short duration.
Okay, and then within the construction management plan, are you satisfied that the sort of correct sort of measures and around reducing noise are in there? What are they?
Well, yes, unfortunately I was going to print out a copy of the report, but I wasn't able to earlier. But they have, I would refer you to the addendum. They are going to be sticking to the relevant British standard with regard to generation of noise through construction activity.
Okay, thanks a lot. Any other questions? No, it's a reasonably complicated one because of various different sort of aspects. But in reality, in many ways, it's an easy decision that we have to make around: are we satisfied that the construction management plan plus the other sort of documents that are provided on other issues such as the trees and the detailed drawings, we satisfied that they are at a standard we would expect? And obviously the recommendation summary is to approve details. So if you're happy to go to a vote, the recommendation, as said, is to approve details. All those in favour, raise your hands. Okay, those against and abstentions. Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice evening. We'll go on to item 11, which is delegated decisions. Can members note those, including whether they're allocated to the correct wards? Noted, thank you. Any other business? There's nothing given over to me. Nothing from Gareth?
No, just obviously the date of the next meeting.
Great, and then the date of the next meeting will be, is it 6th of September?
5th of July.
5th of July.
It's in your chair's brief, I believe. Oh, it is.
5th of July. Great. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, officers.
Thank you,
Harry.
officers who are joining the meeting online.